Welcome to Inside Ideas, brought to you by Innovators Magazine and 1.5 Media. I am so excited today to have wonderful Jenny Kleeman with me on the show. As you know, this is a deep dive, a discussion where we go into dialogue about sustainability, environmentalism, ethics, global food reform, regenerative practices, systems thinking, and many, many other things that try to filter out the biases we have and make sense of our world and the things that we're experiencing. My guest, as you heard, and you can see her beautiful face here, is wonderful Jenny Kleeman. She's an award-winning author and audio and video print person that has really touched some controversial and ethical issues. I would say investigative journalism or investigative reporting. Some of those are for The Guardian, Sunday Times. Her book is coming out in July in the United Kingdom. It's called Sex, Robots, and Vegan Meat. It will be published by Picador, and she even has a copy there. I don't know if she wants to hold it up.
This copy is an advanced reader copy. The real version is kind of the coral color on the blue.
Wonderful.
So the colors are reversed, but that's the cover.
Beautiful. And so on video, she's reported for BBC, Panorama, HBO, Vice News, Tonight and Channel 4 Dispatches. She has a list with Sky News and could go on and on. She does podcasts and Times Radio Friday, Sunday, breakfast on Times Radio with Friday through Sunday. And she's also presented on Hotspot, a 5-part documentary series for BBC Radio 4. The Immaculate Deception is available wherever you can listen to podcasts. And I actually did a search recently on Jenny's podcast, and there are numerous podcasts out there. So we were just on an event together, CogX, for Cognition X, and you were the moderator and did a wonderful job. Have I left anything out on your biography?
No,
Filmmaking.
Very exhaustive bio. It's made me embarrassed about how much I'm jack of all trades and master of none. But thank you for that very gracious introduction. It was a good panel, the CogX panel, wasn't it?
It was absolutely fabulous. I loved it. And had a really good time and was glad that we were able to do it.
Yeah.
Since that time, you so graciously allowed me to review and have a pre-copy of your book, which I devoured in short time and loved every bit of it. I must say though, you're welcome. I must say, it shows both sides. Very emotional, so it could be sometimes called controversial sides of the story, of the issue of what you're reporting. And I think you've probably been working on some of this for quite some time. Am I correct on
yes.
in your travels? Is this because this type of reporting is near and dear to your heart? Is this because you've asked yourself these ethical questions and you want to display both sides of the story? Why is it kind of have this dystopian or controversial flair to it?
I like finding really eye-catching stories that are quite extreme, but in the analysis of them, we can all learn something, even if we're not living extreme lives or at the cutting edge of anything. So I'm drawn to really kind of big, incredible sounding stories that when you look at the meat of them, you realize that, we can all learn something from them. So, and I like the gray area in things. I don't like things where there is one answer. I like the mess of looking into things. And quite often you start looking at something and you think you're going to arrive at one conclusion, and you realize that actually that is so the sort of the least interesting thing about it. So I like charting the journey of investigating something and seeing how you arrive at somewhere that you didn't necessarily think that you were going to arrive at. And I think we live in a world where everything is very polarized and very binary and very black and white. You're either one of these people or another one of these people. And I wish I could fit into one of those camps. It would be life would be really easy if I was just, that kind of person, the vegetarian person or the right-wing person or the feminist person or the environmentalist person. I've never been like that. I've always picked causes according to their individual merits and not how they fit in with my identity. And that's why I was a foreign correspondent for many years, and I worked on this television program for nearly 6 years, making documentaries from around the world. And part of the reason why I did that is, if you're a foreign correspondent, it means you don't have to specialize. You can be interested in science and politics, and you can be interested in stories about women or stories about technology or anything. It just has to be not in your own country. So I managed to find a specialism that allowed me not to specialize. But I've always been like this kind of generalist who looks at for extreme stories, dystopian stories, but not to kind of sensationalize, not to kind of point and stare, but to see what we can all look from unpicking what is sensational about these stories.
I thought it was funny that when we were doing the CogX, I typed in the chat before we started Cowschwitz. They wanted us to do a test instead of saying hello or something.
Yes.
I typed in Cowschwitz. The reason I did that is because in 2014, I gave a TEDx Tomb talk, and right in the background, and I talked about, Cowschwitz and my experience. And the experience is almost one-to-one the experience that you had and write about in the book.
Yes.
But so it's just not that experience. It's the flip side as well. So I think that's really funny.
There's a food section in my book about the future of food, which begins with driving past the Harris Ranch feedlot, Cowschwitz, which I hate driving, really hate driving. And I had to hire a car so I could drive from San Francisco to LA. I was literally clenching the steering wheel for 6 hours, purely so that I could have this visceral experience of smelling this revolting farm. Most journalists would just go on Google Earth, have a look at it, and I am going to all this trouble just so I can have a 10-minute experience of how bad it smells. But I did that, and I stayed at the hotel nearby, because I'm always thinking in terms of because my background is in documentaries, I'm always thinking in terms of scenes, like how can you make a point with a scene instead of just giving people lots of facts. And I think the experience of going past Cowschwitz and how utterly horrific it is a very good way of kind of opening up the food crisis that we're in and how ridiculous our system of food production is.
I agree. Thank you for sharing that. I also lived that experience. I'd actually lived it a few times. I told you I have children, and I'd gone back. I'd went there with my children when they were younger, Disneyland and things. And then I went back there again in 2014 and had that experience driving down the Central Valley. And when we passed there, it was the same thing. And I knew that there was a ranch there. I didn't know it was called Harris Ranch after we got past the place and all the things that I do with food. I actually did a Google search, and when I did the Google search on what was in that area, I just passed on the Google map. It said Cowschwitz, and that's where I got the name from, is because so many people had driven by there and said, "What in the hell is that?" That they actually tagged it on Google as Cowschwitz, and I got that the name from there, and also from Michael Pollan. He's a big person who speaks about that as well. Yes. But I thought that the complete, well-rounding story that you do around meat and around that experience, that it was very both sides of the story, and I really, really like and thank you for that, the great insight and how you kind of let us make the decision of
I think the problem with a lot of the coverage of a lot of these startups that want to solve the problem of the future of meat, a lot of the problems is that the people who cover them are either vegans who really, really want it to work, or people who really don't want it to work. And actually, in many ways, in fact, most of the things that have been written about clean meat, lab-grown meat, cultivated meat, whatever you want to call it, are written by vegans or people who are really in awe of this technology, when actually I am the perfect customer for it, you know, as in someone who does eat meat and who feels bad about it, would rather not eat meat that's produced in such a horrible way, but I do eat meat. So I think I'm probably the first journalist to cover it in great detail who wasn't already sold on the idea.
I agree, and there's a funny story. I was at a restaurant actually speaking to someone about not clean meat, not lab meat, but about Possible Burgers. Had you ever tried Possible Burgers? And she was a vegan, she said, and she's also owns a big vegan company. She's like, yeah, I tried it. I didn't like it. It tasted too much like meat. And so there's the perfect there's the perfect ad for, you know, wow, that's the market. So I think it's really a transitional. It is for those meat eaters who that need to make a transition, want to do something different, have a different feeling about how it is. So I agree totally.
And I really feel that social change is a generational thing. It's to do with what world you are native in, what world you've grown up into. You know, I look at my son, he's 6 years old. There are friends of mine who are gay couples who are married, who have kids. It's just completely normal for him. It's like, just, he doesn't bat an eyelid because this is the world that he was born into. And for me, I think that I'm not prejudiced, but it's still a little bit startling and unusual when you meet a gay couple with kids, even though I don't disapprove in any way. It's not the same as for my son. He's like, well, yes, some families are like that. And equally, I think that it's the same sort of deal with food. And I say this in the book, it's to do with how we feed our children. That if we teach our kids, I mean, this vegan sociologist who I interviewed said this to me, but if we teach our kids that meat is the tasty thing and the thing that you must eat and that you must eat in every meal, and our kids internalize that, they're going to grow up with a taste for it. Whereas if we kind of rewire our attitude to meat through how we feed our children, then it's much more likely to succeed, I think.
I agree. I don't only want to talk to you about food, but we will probably touch on it again, because all your reporting and your writings are they're wonderful. I just really like the topics and what you broach in those subjects. Immaculate Deception also, and kind of, you know, what came out of that reporting. Also, you know, the Kevorkian death machine, many different things around birth and whether you should get sterilized if you're a drug addict, all sorts of things like that come out. What is there anything special that drew you to those topics? How did you?
Well, again, I mean, that's all part of the same sort of thing, which is, well, there's two things. One is these are extreme stories, but we can all learn something ourselves. So there is Barbara Harris, a woman who wants to sterilize drug addicts, and gives them $300 if they agree to be sterilized. And her take is, you know, it's child abuse to take drugs when you're pregnant. She doesn't really, she doesn't look at the science of how children are affected by drug use in vitro. It's just common sense to her. And she's a good person. You know, she has adopted many children herself. It's all very simple for her. But from sort of pulling out why we're repelled by the idea of sterilizing drug addicts, it poses lots of questions for all of us who aren't drug addicts about, you know, what is appropriate behavior when you're pregnant? Where is the line drawn? And similarly, I mean, the Immaculate Deception, which is a podcast about fertility doctors who use their own sperm to get their patients pregnant without their patients' knowledge or consent. that is a very extreme story, but ultimately it comes down to our attitudes to doctors knowing best, the deference that we give to doctors, and also about shame and secrecy about fertility issues. And that if we were all more open about fertility problems, and particularly male infertility problems, then doctors wouldn't have this kind of power to abuse. So there is no common thread between all of the stories, other than quite often they involve technology, they involve power, people with power from technology or from money, and they sound like either science fiction or like a kind of a fictionalized crime scenario, but they're true. So they're stranger than fiction stories that we can all learn something from.
So there really isn't like this red thread tying them all together, or
I wish there was. It would be so much easier for me to pigeonhole myself and market myself. But no, I mean, I think at the moment I'm really interested in technology, but technology as it pertains to social change. Because
are you like a social activist? Do you want to report on things that inspire thought or
not necessarily? I want to ask. In many ways, all of this is about empowering people. So my book, Sex, Robots and Vegan Meat, is about the extent to which we are relying on technology to solve problems that we could solve by changing our behavior, and how actually being sold a technological solution, it might seem easier, but we actually lose quite a lot by relying on technology, and that the power that we have comes from the power to change our mindset and to change our behavior. So in many ways, they are quite dystopian and quite depressing stories, but there is always an answer, which is, we actually have the power to affect change ourselves. We don't have to wait for, the fantastic scientists to find an answer for us. And in fact, coronavirus is a really good example of that in many ways, that here is a situation where we are all waiting desperately for a vaccine and waiting for scientists to find a solution or a cure. But in fact, we have managed to slow the progress of the virus by changing our behavior. And the power that we have always is through our behavior first and technology second. It's just there's money to be made by people who say they can sell us a solution where we don't have to change anything, because we don't want to change anything. We like the world as it is. But actually, progress comes from the courage to change things.
So since you brought up the controversial topic, the pandemic, would you like to talk a little bit more about your thoughts and feelings? The minute the vaccine's available, you're going to take your two wonderful children and your husband and yourself, or your partner and yourself out and get vaccinated? You're ready for that? That's what you want?
I am ready for that. And that is what I want. I believe in vaccines, certainly. Okay. And I believe that not everybody has to have them, but certainly if enough people have them, that will do its part in controlling this virus and stopping it from taking over. How about you?
I think I'm still up in the air. I really believe that the virus itself is tightly intertwined. Part of it's many viruses are already in our body, but I think a lot of it's caused from our unhealthy biome. And I think that if we, just like the standard flu shot, SARS and the others, the vaccines for those, if we let it run its course for the 2 years, that we'll find out, even if they have a vaccine, that it just kind of will disappear. And the new pandemic, the new virus, will come up, the new SARS, the new...
it may well be that by the time a vaccine is available, we have enough resilience within us that we don't need it. That is certainly true.
I would rather see us fix our biome, our world, and the way we eat, and our own health, because I really don't think that the virus is the true indicator of death. I think the true indicator of death is being unhealthy. I think if you have pre-existing conditions, if you're a high at-risk person that already has some issues, that you run that risk of truly death, and especially in where you live, of certain healthcare systems, availability or not, on how that works. So
the interesting thing about it, though, is that it isn't about just individual risk. One of the insidious nature of this disease, that you can be a carrier and be asymptomatic, that you can feel totally fine and be going about your business, and you can kill somebody. And by being in the same room as them, you can kill your parents or your grandparents.
Yeah.
That's what worries me. I myself am not worried about me getting the disease per se, or even my children. My children are back at school at the moment. I just feel that the lockdown is going to be is going to have a very long tail in terms of the damage it does. And I'm not talking about to economies, because everybody knows about the damage to economies, but the damage to people's mental health, the damage to children's education,
Huge.
Just vast. There will be some kids who will be several years ahead of other kids in the same academic year. How are teachers going to deal with that disparity of educational level? For the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to be dealing with the aftermath of this. And alcoholism, people sitting at home just eating and drinking. So
domestic abuse. I mean,
yes,
the list goes on.
Absolutely. So the virus is terrible. The damage to the economy is terrible. But this is how, it's also how I would approach a story. I would leave it for other journalists to look at the health stuff and the economic stuff, and I'm interested in all the social stuff, the stuff that you haven't really thought about, and I would be looking for the kind of the most startling permutations of those examples, and there will be so many over the next few years, things that we can't even conceive of now.
I totally agree. I speak a lot about resilient, desirable futures. What does the future look like? I also, as you know, I'm a climate activist and speak a lot about the climate and how that impacts our life. The pandemic didn't affect me very much. Actually, my projects have tripled. I speak to more people about resilience, how to build it into your lives, how to continue working, how to use technology and to move forward. And if you've implemented that technology, that resilience into your life, there's some benefits, because when a pandemic comes, you have a little bit of resilience, more so than others. And so I've been, in some respects, living in the future for a long time. So this was it's very serious. It's very saddening, but it's put me in a unique position to help others and to be able to do many things. And I find those people that were prepared to listen to things and kind of took a look into the future. They asked the burning question that I also spoke about in CogX: what's the future? Then they seemed to be prepared because they were thinking about what the future. Mm-hmm. Having said that, what does your version of a resilient, desirable future look like? Are you like set on the track that you're planning on wearing masks now for the rest of your life? You're probably going to go to the next step, some respirators or a space suit, so that we can enjoy our planet.
I really hope not. I think it's anti-human to keep people apart and to keep people's faces covered. So I really hope that we can get over that. But in terms of what a resilient future is, I think it has been a very useful exercise to see that we can pause and stop and do things differently. Whether or not we use this opportunity as a time for real change remains to be seen. But for example, people are discovering that they like cycling, they like making their own bread. And yet maybe that's a fad, but maybe it's not. Maybe you make your own bread and you realize it's much nicer than the bread from the shops, and it doesn't last as long, but actually it's much tastier. And certainly I hope the cycling thing will remain for as long as possible, although obviously the issues with public transport are very great, and I really hope we can find a way of getting the tubes and the buses in London certainly back up and running. I think we all need to learn from all of this. What we need to learn is that we can adapt, that we are highly adaptable creatures, and that this capitalist imperative to keep on producing all the time is not the way it has to be. There are alternative ways of being, and hopefully this will inspire people to be more bold and imaginative when it comes to conceiving of those different ways.
So that leads perfectly into the big question. I usually start out with it right away. I ask all my guests this. What does a world that works for everyone look like for you?
A world that works for, well, that is a very big question.
It's just a small one, but I'm sure you've, in one way or another, you've thought about before, and
I think that
yeah.
the gratuitous inequality that we have in the world at the moment is absolutely grotesque. But that's not to say that I have an alternative system that would mean that the world. Today in the UK, it's been announced that DFID, the Department for International Aid, is going to be abolished and rolled into the Foreign Office. I think this is a terrible, terrible thing. I am a great believer in wealthier countries, not just giving aid, but investing properly in other countries and spreading the wealth around. I am a bit worried about the power that philanthropists can have with no oversight with their philanthropic dollars. But I do think that beyond a certain amount, it is just completely, I think one human being only needs a certain amount of money, and there are so many orders of magnitude more amounts of money that individuals have that it makes my mind explode. So I think a world that works for all is one where there aren't enormous disparities of wealth, where there is decent healthcare for everybody, decent food and sanitation for everybody, and whereby people in wealthier countries realize that to have the lives that they want to have, they need to invest heavily in other countries, because then these problems that happen overseas won't affect them so much. In the UK, we've had not a great few years, I have to say. It's not a glorious time in my nation's history, and there's been a lot of fear of the outside world. We voted to leave the European Union, which I think is a complete disaster, partly out of a desire to control our borders. But I think that I think immigration is something that's not necessarily to be feared, and certainly isn't something to be feared if you're investing properly in other countries, so that there isn't such a disparity of wealth that people are prepared to risk their lives to come here. That's a very broad answer, but I hope it goes some way to giving you an answer.
I asked that to many people, and also recorded many people with that answer, and you did just fine. So I
don't have an alternative system to capitalism at the moment, but I think the current system is incredibly imperfect, and there has to be a better way, and it is just not right that there is such disparities of wealth and power in the world.
Inequality, disparities. Do you feel that it can be just a national solution, something that just occurs in the United Kingdom, or do you think it has to be something that's a global solution?
Everything has to be a global solution now. We are so interconnected. I mean, this virus has shown this as well, and it's ridiculous that each country has their own little policy and their own policy of lockdown or quarantine or whatever. We have always been globally interconnected, now more so than ever with technology. And that's what makes me very sad about the direction that Britain is going in, and has been going in the past few years, is this idea that we can retreat back into our own little nation is it's a fantasy. It's not how the world works anymore, or ever did.
How you probably don't know this, but how can they pull the foreign aid back, but yet most of their resources and trade that go to the basic resources to feed and give energy and the wherewithal for the United Kingdom comes from other places that probably are part of the ones that need that aid. So they're just saying, no, we're not giving you aid anymore, but you can still provide us with those products and that food. That's okay.
I mean, I think we're still going to give countries aid. We've always given aid as a proportion of our GDP. Well,
Okay.
we've done that recently. And that's been really criticized by a lot of people who say we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't just be giving this certain proportion of our GDP away. We should be giving away things on their merits. It should be able to go up and down according to need. But aid is a very political thing. And in the UK, we don't just give aid because we are a nice, benevolent country. We do it to wield power around the world, under no illusions about that. But equally, we can give aid in a really self-interested way that works for everybody in the end. Investing in the countries where citizens are so poor that they're or so war-torn that they're trying to risk their lives sailing across the Mediterranean to eventually get to us. We don't do that at the moment.
How, how do you feel about voting with your dollars, with your pounds? How do you feel about voting with your actual political vote? Do you think that's the solution to make the change?
I think that you need to do a lot more to make change than just buy ethically. I really think that hashtag activism is not necessarily a good thing, that people feel like they're a good person because they've tweeted something and used the right hashtag, or they've changed their profile picture to a certain color. All of that social media is being about curating your sense of self and reflecting to the world what kind of person you are. Yeah, I'm afraid if you want to make change, you actually have to really do stuff. You have to write to your representatives and make very clear what you would like them to do. And yeah, it's very important to be an ethical consumer, but it's not enough. That's the whole thing. You have to go further and not just say, okay, I buy this over this, because unless everybody else is making the same decision as you, nobody cares what you're buying.
So in our world today, we've got the Trumpocalypses, the Bolsonaros, the Putins, the Shays, the Erdogans, the Duartes, and they were all voted into power some one way or the other. They got to the position, and whether it was Cambridge Analytics or Facebook or WhatsApp, however they got in their electoral college, and are you feeling kind of a civil unrest or a feeling that our civilization framework is on shaky ground, that more and more rapidly, almost exponentially growing, that this is just a kind of a trend that's for the future?
I feel that there is a constituent part of the population of all of those countries that have elected these populist leaders that felt neglected, and rightfully so. They were being neglected, and that all of those leaders were able, through very simple messaging, to appeal to them. I think that none of those leaders have the leadership quality necessary to follow through on whatever promises they've made, and I don't think they will continue to be elected. And I think at the moment we are seeing a renewed enthusiasm for expertise and for people who actually know stuff, because it's kind of useful now to know stuff. I mean, that really frightened me, that the disregard for expertise, and also for the plasticity of the truth, the fact the truth can be whatever Donald Trump says it is on a given day, and that anything else is fake news. That really worries me as a journalist, where you hope that there is something that is the truth, or some figure that, some proper bit of research that actually means something. I think we are swinging back from that. I hope we are. I hope this is just a blip in history, but it came from something really real, which was the neglect of a very large number of people who felt that their voices weren't being heard, and they weren't being heard. And I think people are listening now, but I think that the answer that we arrived at of those particular governments was not the right one.
That brings me perfectly to the question I wanted to ask you. If you were thrust into the position to be on one of the journalists, the reporters that had to sit in the briefings of the White House, what do they call that? The press corps. How in the hell would you handle that? What would you do? Would you be there? How would you deal with, we've all seen it on the news. As an investigative reporter, as someone who is good at seeing both sides, how in the hell do you deal with something like that?
He does not give informative answers in those press conferences. So you're not going to leave there with information that's useful. The only useful thing you get from those press conferences is his reactions to certain questions. So it's not about the answers that you're going to get, because you will not get illuminating answers. It's about the questions that you ask. So I would, whatever the issue of the day is, I would be thinking very carefully in advance and coming up with something very brief and very clear and very unaggressive and very simple. A point of fact that I would ask him, or just something extremely direct and what should be unthreatening to somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. And that's what I would ask. And his response to it would be the story, not how he responds, not what he says, I think.
Would that ever be a job or something that you'd think
Never
is
in a million years.
never in a million years?
Never. I would hate to be a political journalist. I cannot stand interviewing people who have been schooled in the art of media management, how to not answer a question. I mean, I don't interview actors and actresses. I don't interview people who are using journalists as a PR opportunity because I find it exhausting. I'd much rather deal with ordinary people in interesting circumstances who actually want to tell you their story. So any time that you feel that you're being used, it's a really, really unsatisfying experience. So I would never go there.
And that's one reason why I really love your book, because it showed not only the big food section, but it showed both sides of the story. And yeah, a little bit of your personal feelings or thoughts came out, which was beautiful, but it really just let someone who maybe is not empowered with the ability to see both sides in a situation over time, and maybe are only fed with one side of the story, to see both sides, to ask questions, to be, not only the ethics of it, but to kind of ask those questions to yourself, because I think that's when the true discovery comes out. You said something a few moments ago, empowering people. So that's kind of the red thread. You want to empower people.
Certainly. I mean, I certainly want to. And for me,
is it sense making, or is it knowledge? Yeah. What is the empowerment that you're giving them, or that you want them?
So for me, what makes me feel empowered is feeling like I really know something. Like I have a right to have an opinion on something because I went and saw it for myself, or I went and spoke to the person who's making it, or the person who's been through it themselves. So I tell those stories to other people, and I don't give you the press release or the line from the government spokesman. I actually go and see it at source in a primary way, and I try and tell it like it is. So I very much want to empower people with a thorough knowledge of things, hopefully in an entertaining way. But, there is nothing that I say in my book, in my articles, in my documentaries that isn't backed up. And, I will never say, studies show. I will tell you which study and what it shows, because I want to empower people with a huge variety, a body of information, so that when they make opinions, it's based on really, really good sources. And that's what gives me confidence, is feeling like when I'm talking about something, I do know what I'm talking about. And I have the confidence now, if you were to ask me a question about something I don't know about, like, what's the alternative for capitalism? I have the confidence to say I don't know. But that's how I'm empowered, is by having actually gone and done the shoe leather and gone and spoken to people. I feel entitled to have opinions because I've actually been and seen it for myself.
You love technology, or I don't know if you love it, but you report a lot about it, yes, or that's always a function. Do you have a belief or optimism that technology can help us fallible humans, or that maybe we should leave it behind? What is your stance on in all aspects, not just the food aspect, but all aspects?
I think technology technology defines us as human beings. We use technology. That's what makes us different from other apes, is our amazing dexterity with technology. And there is tremendous potential for technology to help us, but we need to be aware of two things. One is that technology has lots of unintended consequences that none of us can foresee or control, and nobody has ever been able to. I mean, I don't know when this came out, if any of us knew that we would become so completely addicted to our phones that they would become, I say this in my book, the external organ that none of us can live without. I mean, some people are better at putting it down than others, but I think nobody really knew how much it would take over our lives. And the other thing is, I think about technology, we need to be aware of the extent to which it is used as a solution when in fact it is a circumvention of a problem. And we need to be aware of, we can also change our behavior in order to arrive at the same solutions, rather than buying an extra bit of kit or an extra, this on my computer or whatever, that actually quite often these are useful tools, but they are not the answer in and of itself. So technology is massively useful, as long as we're also prepared to change the world through changing our behavior, and also accept that technology always comes with ramifications that we won't be able to predict.
We're getting close to wrapping up our time, but I do have some more questions. I wish we would have had some more time. We're probably going to have to try this again so that we can go into even deeper dive.
Well, let's see how far we go. My kids are going to be home very soon, so when they come home, I'm going to have to shoot off. But let's see how far.
That's totally fine. Family first. A couple more standard questions that I like to ask, kind of get a deep dive into you. What's your favorite food?
That's a difficult one because it's very unethical. What's my favorite food? What is my favorite food? Well, I like chocolate a lot. I like French fries a lot. I like sushi. I still really like steak, but it's something that I'll only have like 1 or 2 times a year now, having done the reporting that I have for my book.
Yeah, that's how you the first meal your partner cooked for you. Yeah,
when we got engaged. Yes.
Yeah. A special day. What's your favorite meal to make for others? And is that because of a certain reason, like showing them love, or just because it gets
that is interesting? So there are meals that I like to make for others that might be more impressive, grander meals. But actually, if you talk about showing love, the meal that I probably enjoy making most is I make my kids porridge every morning, and we all eat porridge together, and we all eat porridge in a slightly different way, with bananas in it and nuts. And my son has certain kinds of nuts, and my daughter has other kinds and whatever. And whenever I'm away for work, that is what I really miss, is making porridge for my kids in the morning. There is something very sort of wholesome about that. So that is not a glamorous meal. I mean, I make other things. I make amazing chocolate fondants, and I can make bread, and I can make, there are lots of different things that I make.
It depends on the porridge. I don't know.
But the porridge, if you're talking about food that I really enjoy, that I find most fulfilling to make, is the porridge I make every morning for my kids.
Do you believe your children will think about that as they become adults, that they'll say, hey, my mom used to make porridge for me and bring back
I know that
memories?
one of the things my kids have really enjoyed in lockdown is doing a lot of cooking with me and making bread and things like that with me. We've been making pizza, and they really enjoy that. And I'm sure when they remember lockdown, they'll remember it as a time when we did all this stuff together as a family, certainly, and took time over it, and realized that good food takes time to make, but is incredibly rewarding when you do make it. And it's been nice to show them that trade-off of the time you put in and the joy you get out of it.
Do you feel that our global food systems need to stay the way they are, or be reformed or changed? Or when you were writing about these technologies around food and about clean meat, in vitro lab meat, things like that, with hope that, man, okay, this is fabulous, let's go, or was there anything behind that where you like saying, well, we need something new than what we have had in the past?
What we have at the moment is completely unsustainable, so we need something. I'm not sure growing meat in a lab is the answer. It does seem to be an incredible kind of overshoot engineering, a very over-engineered problem for something which could be solved with, let's just eat less meat. But that's easy enough for me to say. There are people in other parts of the world who will want to eat as much meat as we do in the UK. And there will be people, certainly in America, who will find it very hard to give up their burgers that they're used to eating all the time. So it's easy to say and not easy to do. But our current global food system is it's one of the things that made me embark on the book, was thinking about, in 200 years, when we look back on how we live today, what are we going to shake our heads and think, oh my God, we were so primitive about? And I mean, that's where the death section came from. I think the way that we handle people at the end of their lives is a disgrace in many countries. But I think with food, certainly, it's just going to be a shame of our era that there is so much waste and so much hunger and so much overconsumption. and so much environmental damage caused by our palate preferences, that I think it absolutely has to change in enormous fundamental ways. And part of that comes from what our palates are, you know, what we choose to eat, and part of that has to come from how it's produced. So both.
Great. I mean, I mentioned this on CogX as well, but I believe that it's one tool for the toolbox of our, as you just mentioned, our multifaceted, complex, broken food systems, from food waste to how we produce to the chemicals, the transportation, and on and on, that it could be a help, and it could make a big change and help us on the sustainable. But I think the entire global food systems need to be really revamped and brought up to speed. I mean, the agriculture, 12,000, 10,000 years old, and we've had 5 to 6 innovations in that time. And so when an innovation like that comes about, even though we could probably date it back even before the discussion from Winston Churchill and 50 years hence, which is also discussed in your book, that we can really say there has to be something better. We need to figure that out. If we compare it to any other industry in the world, the oil, coal, and gas industry isn't pulling all that out of the ground and then saying, okay, we're going to throw 30% of it away immediately. That's just a bad business model. That's not a very efficient. And so in that respect, I just want to comment. It is multifaceted. I think it can be one tool. Yeah. If we do it and get it right, will it be the magic bullet that fixes and saves? No, it won't.
I mean, it may be. This is something that I came across in the fish chapter in my book, which was kind of more enlightening, where I met some really good guys who are trying to grow fish, and they were saying, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be what we think it's going to be, which is a slab of steak, or whatever it is. It could be a flavoring agent. It could be something that you seed into foods that gives people that taste, but is a different thing, is a different kind of food from what we can conceptualize now. And I think you're right. We need to have a varied toolbox. But the one thing that we cannot have is business as usual, because this is totally unsustainable and kind of grotesquely wasteful and unfair, the current system. So it has to change if we don't all die out first.
Yeah, I mean the basics when we right when we're born, and you have an experience with this, you know, we get our mother's milk, we get to breastfeed and get our nutrition, unless, you know, for some reason there's some other issue for that. But you were, I don't know how many years ago it was that you were approached breastfeeding your child. Yes. and a security officer or something, you know, told you. And
security guard told me that I had to stop. And it was actually, I felt sorry for him, because he really picked the wrong person, because I totally know what the law is in the UK, which is that you can't ask a breastfeeding woman to stop. So I immediately went into journalist mode and said, oh, that's very interesting. How come you're asking me to stop? And he said, oh, it's not allowed here. And I said, I'd love to know more about this. How can your rules override the rules of the land? And then he backed away pretty fast. But yeah, women get this all the time. And you know, I was being very discreet. I was in the corner of the room, and I shouldn't even have to say that. You know, it's very, very strange. Our entire attitude to food and nutrition is very strange. Yeah. That is disgusting, but drinking cow's milk is not disgusting.
Yeah, it's absurd. I mean, we've definitely gotten some things wrong, or that need some looking at and some fixing over time. But it really starts right. You know, the problems begin right at birth sometimes, which is also discussed in your book. So not only does it need to be a multifaceted approach to kind of solving and fixing this, and I want to ask, what for you would be the biggest sustainable takeaway that you could give our listeners, our viewers, kind of a little sustainable takeaway of a message that if you could go up to each one of them and say, hey, I have this message just for you, this is going to solve your problems, or the message I need to get off my chest to make this world a little bit better. Is there such a message, or is there anything that you would
Well,
like
there would
to
be two
depart?
things that I would say, which is that our real power comes from our power to change our behavior. And those changes that you make in your life, that is how social change happens, not through fancy bits of technology, and not through amazing inventions and, you know, things that are going to, giant umbrellas over the planet that are going to cure climate change, or whatever it is. We are the change. And also that we don't need so much stuff. You know, there's so many changes in life. So many benefits can be bought, can come from just changing your behavior and not buying stuff. And people are constantly telling us, because of the system that we live in, that the answer is always buying stuff. Like, pay for this diet instead of eat exactly what you were eating before, but just eat a little bit less, or eat a little bit better. There's no money to be made in saying eat a bit less, sleep a little bit more, sleep more hours. But there is money to be saying, you know, I'll sell you these melatonin tablets that will make you sleepy at the right time. I'll sell you this diet plan. I'll sell you there are a lot of people trying to sell us stuff. And you don't need the stuff. The power comes from you changing your behavior. And you don't need to spend money on a meditation app. Just meditate, you know. Yeah. It sounds so obvious, but it's taken me quite a long time to realize this, that actually we need to be aware of how all the time we're being sold solutions that we don't really need, and that the answers are already in our own hands.
I totally agree. Thank you for those wonderful words of wisdom. When asked, what are the top 5 ways that we could draw down our problems with climate change, greenhouse gases, human health? The first one I always say is global food reform. But the second and third, most people don't understand. I always say empowering women and empowering girls.
Absolutely.
The fourth is rethinking refrigeration. But that second and third, a lot of people don't get. I know you get it.
Yes.
And what I feel that all your work that I've ever seen, the way you act, the way you live, the way you write, the way you report, is one that is empowering women and girls to be the change that we need to see in this world. And I know that if they are empowered, if they have that knowledge and difference in their lives, that empowerment in their lives, that we will have a very resilient and desirable future. And so I thank you for that. And I would only applaud you and encourage you to continue that mission to empower women and girls
kind
in the future.
I'm not sure I deserve that, but it's
yes, you do. You definitely do. So thank you very much, Jenny. And I hope we can continue this, pick this up further as your book hits the shelves in July in the UK. Sex Robots and Vegan Meat. It's a wonderful read. and you will actually see lots of success, I'm sure. So I'd love to have you back and take a deeper dive with you then.
Come back. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Marc.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Take care.